Canada has just confirmed one of the most strategically valuable mineral reserves on the continent. Beneath a quiet stretch of Quebec forest sits roughly 120 million tons of ore containing about 5 million tons of high-grade graphite. In a world where lithium and cobalt often take the spotlight, it is graphite that determines who actually controls the EV battery chain and who holds leverage over the next generation of industrial power. This discovery arrives at a moment when President Donald Trump is escalating his pressure on Canada, threatening new tariffs and even hinting at delays in opening the Gordie Howe Bridge. Yet while Washington leans on old tools, Canada has secured an asset that the United States does not have and cannot replace. It is a rare moment where Canada finds itself holding the advantage, not reacting to someone else's move.
In Saint-Michel-des-Saints, geological surveys a decade ago revealed unusually strong graphite signatures scattered across the forest floor. Nouveau Mont Graphite set up a test facility, refined extraction methods, and built a case for a large-scale operation. Ottawa took notice. By late 2025, the project was designated a national interest priority. That label is used sparingly, reserved for initiatives that directly support Canada's future security and industrial strength. For the surrounding region, the stakes are deeply personal. Years of American forestry tariffs, pushed aggressively during Trump's first term, hollowed out local incomes and forced families to move. A modern graphite operation offers not only jobs, but a path back to stability. The target for full commercial production is 2028, and if that timeline holds, Canada will enter the next decade with a mineral advantage the United States cannot duplicate.
Graphite is the core ingredient of every lithium-ion battery anode. It makes up more of the battery by volume than any other material. Without graphite, the clean energy transition does not move, drones do not fly, and electric vehicles do not function. China dominates nearly the entire global refinement chain. The United States produces almost none of its own supply. Canada's 5 million ton reserve changes the equation. It provides a democratic, G7-based alternative at a scale large enough to support both domestic and continental manufacturing.
Prime Minister Mark Carney has been building a new minerals framework grounded in independence and long-range planning. Permitting timelines have been tightened, environmental assessments modernized, and partnerships expanded with Europe and Asia. By classifying the Quebec mine as a national interest project, Ottawa is signaling to industry and allies alike that graphite is no longer just a commodity, it is a strategic foundation for Canada's economic security. The deposit is large enough to justify new refining operations and downstream manufacturing in Quebec and Ontario. This aligns with Carney's broader push for supply chain sovereignty during a time when global systems feel increasingly unstable.
The United States is racing to build its EV and advanced battery sectors, yet it lacks the most essential ingredient. China's tightening export controls in 2023 and 2025 sent shockwaves across American automakers. Even the Pentagon has issued warnings about graphite supply disruptions. Against this backdrop, Canada's new reserve stands out as the only large-scale, politically stable supply in North America. Trump's tariff pressure has little effect when the United States cannot replace what Canada now controls. American manufacturers will rely on Canadian graphite whether Washington likes it or not. This gives Ottawa quiet but substantial influence heading into the 2026 CUSMA review. For the first time in decades, Canada enters a major negotiation holding something the United States critically needs. The United States imports nearly all of its graphite, with roughly 2/3 coming from China and an annual import bill of about $140 million USD. As demand for secure, non-Chinese graphite grows across North America, manufacturers are already positioning Canadian supply as the only stable path forward. Recent trade data shows Canada already exports graphite to the US in modest but growing volumes, and Canadian origin graphite has historically been priced more competitively than other imports, averaging around $734 USD per ton, compared with the much higher US import average of roughly $1,900 USD. Losing access to that future stream would force Washington back into higher-cost Chinese sourcing. Based on current prices and projected demand, the financial hit would be immediate. Annual raw material costs would rise by at least $120 million USD, and once EV delays, factory slowdowns, and battery price spikes are counted, total losses could easily surpass $400 million USD every year. For an industry already struggling with inflation and supply chain uncertainty, that is a strategic vulnerability the US cannot absorb.
The timing of the discovery intersects with another major shift.
China is using buying power to pressure the United States and weaponizing export controls in targeted sectors. Trump's renewed confrontation with Beijing has pushed the two countries into a fresh cycle of retaliation. Canada, however, is carving out a different path. Carney's diplomatic outreach to China has opened channels that serve Canada's mineral interests without compromising security principles. At the same time, Canada is strengthening partnerships with South Korea, Japan, and the European Union. A 5 million-ton graphite reserve gives Ottawa credibility in these relationships. Canada becomes a connector and a stabilizing force, not a passive participant.
The symbolic weight of the mine is enormous. A region weakened by American trade actions is now central to Canada's most forward-looking industrial strategy. Instead of pleading for tariff relief, Quebec is building the supply chains of the future. Families return, businesses invest, and a sense of local pride resurfaces. The discovery shows how Canada can grow stronger, not by mirroring American tactics, but by building long-term advantages grounded in resources, technology, and stability. If Canada executes the full vision, several outcomes come into view. Canadian graphite becomes the backbone of Western EV production. Canada gains real negotiating power in the CUSMA review, no longer boxed in by American demands. New processing plants rise in Quebec and Ontario, attracting foreign investment. And if Washington continues to rely on pressure instead of partnership, Canada has the option to deepen its ties with Europe and Asia, forming parallel battery corridors that bypass the United States. A future where Canada is indispensable to global clean energy becomes entirely plausible.
Canada's graphite discovery is more than a mineral win. It is a turning point in the economic relationship with the United States. For decades, Washington shaped the terms and Canada absorbed the impact. Today, the strategic value of graphite reverses that dynamic. America needs what Canada has. China is watching the shift. And Canada is stepping into a position of influence that reflects its real strengths rather than its old vulnerabilities. The question for Washington is simple. In a world where Canada controls the mineral the United States cannot replace, does Trump adapt or double down on a strategy that leaves America increasingly exposed? Canada has already made its move. The next move belongs to the United States.
The administration has used that declaration as a pretext to impose sweeping tariffs on a friend, on a neighbor, on an ally, which are taxes paid by American consumers and businesses on Canadian imports.
In Washington, something unusual is happening. A U.S. senator is standing up not against a foreign rival, but against her own president, and for Canada. That's the story unfolding this week as Senator Amy Klobuchar, joined by both Democrats and Republicans, takes the floor of the U.S. Senate to demand an end to President Trump's tariffs on Canadian goods. At a time when the White House keeps declaring economic victory, the reality looks far different. The tariffs that were supposed to protect America's economy are now dividing its own leaders. Even inside Congress, voices are rising to say what many Americans already feel, that this trade war has gone too far and that its victims are not in Ottawa, but at home. When even Washington senators start echoing the same frustration Canadians have been expressing for months, you know something fundamental has shifted. The resolution introduced by Senator Klobuchar wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a bipartisan act, backed by Senators Tim Kaine, Rand Paul, Mark Warner, and Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, aimed at formally ending the national emergency Trump invoked to justify tariffs on Canada. Their message is simple. The so-called emergency doesn't exist. There's no security threat at the northern border, no crisis in cross-border trade, only a policy built on political impulse. In April 2025, the Senate had already voted once to terminate the same emergency declaration, but the administration refused to lift it.
Instead, it doubled down, raising tariffs to 35% on August 1st, and then added another 10% in late October, this time, astonishingly, in response to a provincial ad campaign from Ontario that used Ronald Reagan's old speech criticizing protectionism. For many in Congress, this was the breaking point. What began as an argument over trade had turned into a test of constitutional power. Lawmakers from both parties began to agree that tariffs imposed by presidential mood swings were destabilizing not just the economy, but America's credibility. It's rare to see Rand Paul and Chuck Schumer agree on anything, yet this time they did, because no matter where they stand politically, they could see that punishing Canada, a historic ally, was punishing America itself. Behind the politics lies a straightforward economic truth. Every tariff is a tax, one that American consumers and businesses pay first. Since the new tariffs began in March 2025, the costs have rippled across U.S. households and industries. According to data cited in the Senate hearing, the average American family is paying nearly $2,000 more per year for everyday goods. Small businesses and tourism towns near the border are feeling it most, with fewer visitors and rising costs for supplies. Aluminum cans, lumber, and farm equipment, all dependent on cross-border supply chains, have become more expensive not because of shortages, but because of policy. Economically, it's a loop that feeds itself. When the U.S. taxes imports from Canada, it drives up domestic prices, reduces consumer spending, and hurts exports in return. The problem isn't abstract. It's visible in empty stores along border towns and the 20% drop in Canadian visitors this year reported by state tourism boards. So while the administration calls these tariffs America First, the reality looks more like America turning on itself. North of the border, the response has been measured. Prime Minister Mark Carney, who met recently with several U.S. senators in Ottawa, has avoided escalation. Instead, he keeps stressing dialogue and long-term stability. During those meetings, Carney reportedly told lawmakers that the U.S.-Canada relationship has become mostly transactional. For many Canadians, that single phrase captured the current era perfectly. It signaled that Canada is no longer willing to define its economic identity through Washington's choices. In fact, each new tariff from the White House has only strengthened the case for diversification. Canadian trade missions are multiplying across Asia, and public sentiment at home has shifted sharply towards supporting Buy Canadian initiatives. While American politics seem locked in a cycle of tariff announcements and Senate rebellions, Ottawa's tone is calm, consistent, and confident. It's not the noise of confrontation that defines leadership, but the discipline to outlast it. Back in Washington, the debate is no longer about whether tariffs are good or bad. It's about limits, on power, on law, and on the president's ability to use emergency authority to change trade policy at will. The Senate resolution that Klobuchar and her colleagues pushed forward marks one of the few times in recent memory that Congress has united across party lines to check executive power. The courts, too, are weighing in. A federal trade court panel, composed of judges appointed by 3 different presidents, unanimously ruled that the administration's broad use of emergency powers to impose these tariffs was unlawful under the 1977 National Emergencies Act. Their decision underscored a simple principle: Congress controls the power to tax, not the White House. Economically, the message is just as significant. It reflects a growing recognition that the stability of North American trade, built over decades through the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, cannot survive under constant policy whiplash. When tariffs change 100 times in a single year, as trade groups testified, no company can plan investments or hiring. The revolt in Washington, then, isn't just political. It's a reminder that predictability is part of prosperity. Ironically, while America wrestles with its own divisions, Canada is experiencing a quiet surge in national confidence.
The tariffs that were supposed to pressure Canada's economy have instead unified public opinion and accelerated industrial policy. Across provinces, industries are investing more at home and turning outward to new Asian markets. Even U.S. border towns are feeling it, with fewer Canadian visitors and struggling small shops. Tourism losses are now visible across several states. To many observers, it's a striking reversal. The tariffs intended to demonstrate strength have exposed weakness, a U.S. policy so erratic that its own senators, courts, and business groups are working to restrain it. Meanwhile, Canada's measured patience is earning global respect. In the end, this debate is no longer about tariffs or trade statistics. It's about how a nation governs itself under pressure. When senators from both parties rise in the same chamber to tell a president that he's gone too far, it marks a turning point. The same words that once united Americans against foreign competition are now being used to defend cooperation with one of their oldest allies. The lesson is simple. Economic nationalism sounds powerful in a speech, but fragile in practice. Tariffs can start as tools of leverage and end as symbols of isolation. For Canada, the turmoil south of the border is no longer a threat, it's validation. Every time Washington chooses confrontation over cooperation, Canada's case for independence grows stronger. Its leaders are choosing strategy over spectacle, stability over chaos, and long-term partnership over short-term politics. As history has shown, real strength isn't measured by how loudly a country shouts, but by how steadily it stands. And right now, Canada is standing tall, while America argues with itself.